Lela lingered near the iron gates of the Kim estate every day after the local soup kitchen closed. 7 years old, with messy dark hair and a light beige hoodie. She was just another shadow on the sidewalk to the men in suits, completely invisible. Nobody knew she spoke Mandarin Chinese. Her father, a brilliant linguist gone a year now, had whispered the tones to her every night like lullabies before the tragedy that left Lela alone on the fringes. Now she simply watched and listened. She had seen the estate's master exactly twice. Dong-Wook Kim, young, sharply dressed, and possessing a gaze like dry ice. The kind of man who viewed a child like her as a glitch in his perfect scenery. His security guards spoke Chinese when they wanted to be private, certain that no one in this neighborhood understood a word. But Lela understood. And at 6:14 p.m. on a sweltering Friday, she heard a sentence that made her heart hammer against her ribs. The trigger is behind the handle. She looked at the heavy front door of the mansion, then at the 2 guards smirking near the fountain, and she knew someone was about to be erased. 6 p.m., 14 minutes earlier. Dong-Wook Kim stood in his reinforced office, adjusted his black silk tie, and stared at the empire he had built on cold calculation. At 30 years old, he was a man of zero sentiment. To him, people were tools and trust was a fatal flaw. His phone vibrated. It was his driver. "The car is approaching the main entrance, sir." Dong-Wook checked his watch. He prided himself on precision. In exactly 14 minutes, he would walk through his front door. He had no idea it was the last thing he was ever expected to do. Lela's fingers curled into the rough fabric of her oversized hoodie, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. To the world, she was just a small, messy-haired girl sitting on a concrete ledge, but her mind was a whirlwind of translating tones and terrifying intent. The guards, the same men who had tossed a crumpled dollar at her yesterday, were still leaning against the stone pillar, their voices low and sharp in Mandarin. They spoke of pressure plates and remote triggers, words her father had once explained with academic pride, now twisted into a blueprint for murder. Lela looked at the massive front door of the Kim estate, its dark wood gleaming under the porch light, and saw it for what it truly was, the lid of a casket. Every time a car slowed down near the gate, Lela's breath hitched. She was 7 years old, a ghost in a light beige hoodie, and she knew a secret that could level the building. She thought of her father, the way his eyes used to crinkle when she mastered a difficult vowel, and the fierce spirit her mother had always urged her to keep. She wasn't just a street kid. She was a witness. But as she looked at the guards' smirking faces, a cold realization settled in her stomach. If they saw her watching, if they realized the dumb child understood their every word, she wouldn't just be invisible. She would be gone. The clock on the gatehouse flickered to 6:05 p.m. The air felt thick, charged with the impending arrival of a man who didn't even know her name. Dong-Wook Kim was coming home to a house rigged to swallow him whole, and the only thing standing between him and the explosion was a girl who had been shooed away like a stray cat for months. Lela gripped her knees, her eyes darting between the suspicious guards and the long driveway. She was small, she was hungry, and she was terrified, but she was the only one who could hear the trap snapping shut. Lela's world was measured in the distance between the iron bars of the Kim estate and the cracked pavement where she sat every afternoon. To the residents of the wealthy district, she was a fixture of the landscape, as unremarkable as a fire hydrant or a stray patch of weeds. At 7 years old, she had mastered the art of being seen without being noticed, a skill born of necessity and the quiet grief of a child who had lost everything. Her light beige hoodie, stained at the cuffs and smelling of the rain, was her armor against a world that preferred she didn't exist. She watched the heavy gates groan open as a fleet of black sedans approached, their tinted windows reflecting the orange hue of the setting sun. This was the moment the street held its breath. Dong-Wook Kim's arrival was never a quiet affair, yet it was a cold one. As the lead car pulled to a halt, the air seemed to drop several degrees. Lela gripped her knees, watching the door open to reveal a man who moved with the lethal precision of a shark. Dong-Wook stepped out, his black suit sharp enough to cut the air, his jaw set in a line of permanent indifference. He didn't look at the trees, or the sky, or the small girl huddled just 10 feet away from his path. To him, Lela was part of the invisible furniture of his empire, a tool or a nuisance, but never a person. He checked his watch with a flick of his wrist, his mind likely already miles away in a boardroom or a high-stakes negotiation. Lela felt the familiar sting of being looked through, but today, the sensation was eclipsed by a cold, prickling dread. She knew something he didn't. She knew that the very precision he prided himself on was being used as a weapon against him. As he began the walk toward the grand entrance of the house, his stride confident and ruthless, Lela realized that his power was a hollow shield. He was a conqueror who couldn't see the trap at his feet, and she was the only one in the world who could hear the clock ticking. Lela pulled her knees to her chest, the fabric of her beige hoodie acting as a thin barrier against the evening chill. She remained perfectly still, a small, dusty statue that the guards had already dismissed as part of the scenery. To them, she was a child who couldn't possibly understand the weight of their silence, let alone the complexity of their speech. But as the two men in dark business suits stepped closer to the stone pillar where she sat, their voices dropped into the rapid, tonal cadence of Mandarin Chinese. They thought they were safe behind a linguistic wall. They didn't know that Lela's father had been a man who found beauty in every dialect, or that he had spent years making sure those sounds were as familiar to her as her own name. "The boss is 3 minutes out," the taller one said, his eyes scanning the driveway with a cold, predatory focus. He didn't even glance at Lela as he adjusted his earpiece. "Is the pressure plate active?" the second man asked, his voice low and raspy. "Yes." The moment he puts his weight on the threshold and turns the handle, the gas line in the foyer will ignite. The whole front of the house will be gone before he can even scream. It'll look like a tragic accident. A faulty heater, a spark in the dark. The shorter guard smirked, a cruel, jagged expression that sent a shiver down Lela's spine. The house trap. Simple and effective. No one will suspect a thing, especially since we'll be the ones pulling him from the rubble. Lela's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain they would hear it, but they remained oblivious, caught in the arrogance of their own conspiracy. They spoke of Dong-Wook Kim not as a person but as a target, a problem that was about to be solved with fire and steel. She looked at the heavy front door, then back at the guards. They were checking their watches now, the countdown ticking away in the silence between their words. She realized then that the invisible life she had lived was no longer a curse. It was the only weapon she had. They hadn't hidden their plan because they didn't think she was listening. They didn't think she was capable of understanding. As the sound of the approaching motor grew louder, Lela felt the weight of the secret pressing down on her. The Mandarin whisper had revealed a death sentence, and she was the only one in the world who knew that when Dong-Wook Kim reached for that handle, he would be reaching for his own end. She had to move, but her legs felt like lead, and the guards were standing right in her path, waiting for the smoke to rise. The rumble of the engine grew into a roar as the lead black sedan crested the driveway, its headlights cutting through the twilight like the eyes of a predator. Panic surged through Lela, sharp and hot. She scrambled to her feet, her small frame trembling as she moved toward the path of the approaching vehicle. The two guards she had just overheard straightened their suits, their faces resetting into masks of professional loyalty, but Lela could still see the lingering, jagged edges of their smirks. As the car slowed to a crawl near the gatehouse, Lela lunged forward, waving her thin arms. Her voice, usually small and kept for herself, broke into a desperate cry. "Stop! Don't go to the house! Please stop!" The sedan screeched to a halt, but the tinted glass remained up, a wall of obsidian separating her from the man inside. Instead, it was the driver's door that flew open. Chan, a man with a face like weathered stone who had seen Lela 100 times and never once remembered her, stepped out. His expression wasn't one of concern, but of deep, impatient irritation. "Move it, kid," Chan snapped, his voice a low growl. "You know better than to block the path. This isn't a playground." "You don't understand," Lela gasped, her chest heaving as she pointed a shaking finger toward the main entrance. "The door. They said the door is a trap. There's a trigger." "Enough," one of the guards from the pillar interrupted, stepping forward with a heavy, intimidating stride. He placed a gloved hand on Lela's shoulder, his grip tightening just enough to be a threat. He looked at Chun and shook his head with a mocking sigh. "She's been babbling all afternoon. Probably had too much sun or is looking for a bigger handout than usual." Lela looked up at the guard, the man who had just described the house trap in Mandarin, and saw the cold warning in his eyes. He knew she had been close. He was testing to see if she really understood. "I heard you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I heard what you said about the gas line." The guard's expression didn't flicker. He simply looked at the driver. "See? Delusional. I'll move her out of the way, Chin. Get the boss inside. He's already 2 minutes behind schedule." Chun grunted and climbed back into the car, slamming the door with a finality that sounded like a gavel. The guard hoisted Lela back toward the sidewalk, his fingers digging into her beige hoodie. "One more word, little ghost," he hissed under his breath, "and you'll be the first thing we throw into the fire." He shoved her back onto the cracked pavement. Lela watched, helpless and invisible once more, as the sedan's taillights flickered and the car began its final, measured crawl toward the porch. The clock in her head was screaming. He was going to walk to the door, and no one would listen until it was too late. The sedan came to a final, heavy halt at the base of the stone stairs, and the world seemed to fall into a suffocating vacuum. Lela stood on the sidewalk, her small body trembling as she watched the rear door open. Dong-Wook Kim stepped out, a tall, imposing figure in black who moved with a terrifying calmness. He didn't look back, he didn't look around. He simply began the ascent toward the front porch. 60 seconds. The guards by the gatehouse exchanged a silent, jagged look of triumph. Lela didn't think. She didn't plan. She just ran. Her sneakers slapped against the pavement, a frantic, uneven rhythm that broke the practiced silence of the estate. She darted past the gate, her beige hoodie a blur of movement. Behind her, she heard a startled shout from one of the men, but she was already a dozen yards ahead, fueled by a raw, desperate adrenaline. 45 seconds. Dong-Wook was halfway up the stairs. His hand reached for his suit jacket, adjusting the button with the same cold precision he applied to every aspect of his life. To him, the world was a machine, and he was the master of its gears. He had no idea that the mechanism beneath his feet had been rewired for his destruction. "Stop!" Lela's voice was a ragged scream, but the wind seemed to swallow it. She reached the bottom of the stairs just as Dong-Wook reached the top landing. 30 seconds. The shadows of the traitorous guards were moving now, closing in from the perimeter, but they were too far to catch her before she reached him. Dong-Wook stopped. He had heard something, a disturbance in his perfect silence. He turned his head slightly, his sharp profile silhouetted against the glow of the foyer lights. His expression was one of mild, icy annoyance, the look of a king interrupted by a peasant. 15 seconds. Lela scrambled up the final steps, her lungs burning, her vision blurring with tears of pure terror. Dong-Wook turned fully now, his hand hovering just inches away from the heavy brass handle of the front door. He looked down at the disheveled child charging toward him, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. 5 seconds. He began to reach for the handle again, his fingers ready to curl around the cold metal. Lela lunged, her small, dirty hands catching the expensive fabric of his sleeve. She anchored herself to him, her weight pulling at his arm just as he prepared to turn the latch. "Don't!" she sobbed, the word breaking into 1,000 pieces. "Don't open the door." For the first time in his life, Dong-Wook Kim looked at the invisible girl, and for a split second, the clock stopped. The air on the porch felt brittle, as if the tension of the last 60 seconds had sucked the oxygen from the landing. Dong-Wook Kim's hand was a ghost's breath away from the brass handle, a movement so routine it was subconscious. Then the world jolted. Lela didn't just grab him. She anchored herself to him with the desperation of a drowning soul. Her small, dusty fingers curled into the pristine, high thread count wool of his black suit jacket, the fabric bunching under her white-knuckled grip. The physical contact was a transgression of every rule in Dong-Wook's world. He stiffened, his body reacting with the lethal instinct of a man used to threats, his eyes flashing with a cold, sharp light that usually preceded a ruinous command. "Let go," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. It wasn't a request. It was a warning that had silenced boardrooms and broken rivals. But Lela didn't flinch. She looked up, her wide, dark eyes swimming with a terror so raw it momentarily paralyzed his irritation. Her messy hair was windswept, and a smudge of dirt streaked her pale cheek, making her look even more fragile against his towering, immaculate presence. She was trembling so violently that he could feel the vibrations through his arm, yet her grip remained ironclad. "Please," she choked out, her voice a ragged whisper that barely cleared the sound of the wind. "The door. You can't. They're watching." Dong-Wook looked down at the small hand defiling his expensive sleeve, then at the girl's face. For the first time, he didn't see a glitch or a shadow. He saw a human being gripped by a fear so profound it had overridden the instinct for self-preservation. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his own security guards, men he paid a fortune to protect him, standing unnaturally still near the cars. Their faces were masks, but their eyes were fixed on his hand, waiting for the turn of the latch. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Dong-Wook's fingers remained poised over the handle, the metal glinting in the porch light. He could feel the weight of her small life hanging off his arm, a tiny anchor holding him back from a threshold he had crossed 1,000 times. In that moment, the power dynamic of the estate flipped. The man who owned the city was frozen, and the girl who owned nothing held the key to his survival. "I said, let go, child," he repeated, but the ice in his voice was cracking. Lela shook her head, a tear finally spilling over and carving a path through the dust on her face. She didn't let go. She squeezed tighter, her small frame a physical barrier between a powerful man and the shadow of his own end. Dong-Wook's hand tightened into a fist, his patience finally snapping. He looked down at Lela, ready to signal his men to remove her, but before he could speak, the girl's voice cut through the air. Not in the soft, broken Korean of the streets, but in the sharp, fluid tones of Mandarin Chinese. "Nagaman ba shou homien yo chu fa chi," she screamed. "The trigger is behind the door handle." The sound of it was like a gunshot. Dong-Wook froze, his fingers inches from the brass latch. The guards by the gatehouse, who had been moving forward to seize her, stopped in their tracks, their faces draining of color. They stared at the small girl in the beige hoodie as if she had just grown wings. She had broken their wall. She had stolen their only advantage. Lela didn't stop. She looked directly at the two men who had smirked at her, and her voice rose, fueled by a year of silence and a lifetime of being overlooked.
Timenshule y libienne, ranki gundao.
They spoke of pressure plates and gas lines. She turned back to Dong-Wook, her hand still clutching his sleeve, her eyes pleading for him to understand. They think you are just a target. They said the house would ignite the moment you turned the lock. They are waiting for the spark. The silence that followed was absolute. Dong-Wook's gaze shifted from Lela's trembling face to the guards standing near the sedan. He saw the flicker of panic in their eyes, the way their hands instinctively moved toward their holsters. The ghosts in his own team had been unmasked by a child they had dismissed as a nuisance. Dong-Wook slowly withdrew his hand from the door. He didn't look at the house. He looked at the men he had trusted with his life. The cold, calculated mask he wore for the world finally cracked, replaced by a dark, simmering fury. He realized then that Lela wasn't just babbling. She was reciting the very blueprint of his assassination in a language they thought she couldn't possibly know. "Chan," Dong-Wook said, his voice a low, terrifying calm that signaled the end of a reign. "Step away from the car, and someone get the bomb squad. It seems my security team has forgotten who they work for." Lela's grip finally loosened, her strength spent. She slumped against the stone pillar of the porch, her small heart still racing. She had used the language of her father not for beauty, but for survival. She had spoken into the void, and for the first time in her life, the most powerful man in the city had actually listened. The estate fell into a chilling, artificial silence, broken only by the distant, rhythmic chirping of a cricket that seemed oblivious to the chaos. The traitors had been neutralized, forced to the ground by Dong-Wook's inner circle, their faces pressed against the very gravel they had expected to see stained with his blood. Blue and red lights from the specialized unit's vehicles began to dance across the limestone facade of the mansion, casting long, jittery shadows. Dong-Wook stood perfectly still at the base of the porch steps, his gaze fixed on the front door. He watched through the open foyer window as two bomb technicians, clad in heavy, articulated suits, moved with agonizing slowness. They used fiber-optic cameras to peer behind the heavy brass handle and beneath the floorboards of the entryway. The lead technician signaled a halt, his gloved hand trembling slightly as he pointed out a wire as thin as a strand of hair, connected to a localized gas bypass and a high-voltage igniter. "Clear the area further," the technician's voice crackled over the radio. If he had turned that handle, the spark would have met the concentrated gas in less than half a second. The entire front section would have collapsed instantly. Hearing the words, the clinical confirmation of his own extinction, caused a sensation Dong-Wook hadn't felt in a decade. A cold, hollow vacuum in his chest. He turned his head slowly, his eyes finding the small, crumpled figure sitting on the stone ledge. Lela looked even smaller now that the adrenaline had faded. She was hugging her knees, her beige hoodie pulled tight, her eyes wide and glassy as she watched the flashing lights. Dong-Wook walked toward her. His footsteps, usually heavy with the authority of a man who owned everything he surveyed, felt strangely light, almost tentative. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the girl. Really looked at her. He saw the fraying threads of her sleeves, the exhaustion etched into her young features, and the profound bravery that had allowed her to stand against a world that had tried to make her invisible. He looked back at the silent house, the structure he had once considered an impregnable fortress of his own power. It was just wood and stone easily turned to ash. His true protection hadn't come from his billions, his high-tech security, or his ruthless reputation. It had come from a 7-year-old child who had listened when no one else would. A heavy realization settled over him, more explosive than the device inside. He was alive only because of the very person he had spent months ignoring. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently placed it on the stone next to her. For the first time, the ghost of the estate was the only thing that felt real. The weeks that followed were a blur of transformation, not just for the neighborhood, but for the very soul of the Kim estate. Dong-Wook Kim had spent his life settling debts with steel and cold currency, but as he looked at Lela, he realized he was faced with a golden debt, one that could never be repaid by a mere transaction. For the first time, he didn't delegate the task to an assistant. He went himself. He arrived at the cramped, drafty apartment where Lela lived with her elderly aunt, his presence a stark contrast to the peeling wallpaper and the scent of boiled cabbage. When Lela opened the door, she didn't see the ice king of the estate. She saw a man whose eyes had finally thawed. He didn't offer them a handout, he offered them a sanctuary. Within days, Lela and her aunt were moved into a sun-drenched guest villa on the safer, eastern wing of the estate. Not as staff and certainly not as tools to be used. They were guests of honor. Dong-Wook personally oversaw the transition, ensuring Lela had a room filled with books in every language she dreamed of learning and a wardrobe that didn't include a stained, beige hoodie. He found himself walking through the gardens not to take business calls, but to check if the swings he'd had installed were to her liking. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dong-Wook sat with Lela on the very porch that had almost been his tomb. He handed her a small, leather-bound book. "Your father was a linguist," he said, his voice unusually soft. "He left you a gift. I'm making sure you have the best teachers in the world to help you use it. You saved a life with your words, Lela. Now those words are going to build your future." Lela looked at him, her dark eyes no longer wide with terror, but bright with a dawning sense of belonging. She realized she was no longer a shadow at the gate or an invisible fixture of the street. Dong-Wook, the man who once believed emotions were weaknesses, found that his new priority brought him a sense of security that guards and gates never could. He wasn't just protecting a witness. He was guarding the child who had taught him that the smallest voice often carries the greatest truth. The debt was immense, and for the first time in his life, Dong-Wook Kim was happy to spend the rest of his days paying it back. 1 year later, the heavy iron gates of the Kim estate stood open, not for a fleet of armored sedans, but for a busload of children arriving for the inaugural summer program at the Lela Foundation. The mansion that had once been a fortress of cold isolation was now a beacon for the overlooked. Dong-Wook Kim stood on the balcony, watching the activity below. He still wore a black suit, but the sharp, jagged edge of his presence had been replaced by a quiet, grounded authority. He no longer looked through people, he looked at them. His phone buzzed in his pocket, not with a report of a hostile takeover or a security breach, but with a calendar reminder. Lela's play, 2 p.m. The city's most powerful man arrived at the local primary school 10 minutes early. He didn't demand a front-row seat or clear the room with a security detail. He sat in a folding chair in the middle of the crowded auditorium, surrounded by chattering parents and the smell of floor wax. When the velvet curtains creaked open, Lela stepped into the spotlight. She was no longer the ghost in the beige hoodie. She was vibrant, her dark hair polished and her voice carrying to the very back of the room. She spoke her lines with the same fierce clarity she had once used to save a life, her confidence a testament to the world Dong-Wook had built for her. As the play concluded and the room erupted in applause, Dong-Wook found himself standing, clapping with a genuine warmth that would have been unrecognizable to him a year ago. In the lobby afterward, Lela spotted him and ran through the crowd, launching herself into a hug that he caught without hesitation. "Did you hear me?" she asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "I didn't miss a single word." "I heard everyone," Dong-Wook replied, his voice thick with a pride that power had never been able to provide. He realized then that his empire had not been conquered. It had been redeemed. He had spent decades building a throne out of fear, only to find that true security came from the gratitude of a child and the purpose of protecting the vulnerable. As they walked toward the car together, a car that was now just a vehicle, not a mobile bunker, Dong-Wook looked at the girl who had once been invisible. She had taught him that while power can command a city, only purpose can save a soul. The smallest voice had indeed carried the biggest truth, and Dong-Wook Kim was finally, for the first time in his life, home.